Around the spring of 1995, I went camping in Suchez, Georgia, with a small group of friends. It was a nice place with primitive but large forested sites. When I arrived, a couple of good friends were already there. Jolly and enthusiastic, I jumped in and immediately noticed that something was wrong. My friend Kate was looking at me with big eyes. I looked around and saw my friend and her husband Ted standing by the tent with a dirty little guy who looked like David Koresh. Out of the corner of her mouth, Kate whispered, "This guy won't leave us alone," I whispered. I tried to ask him what was wrong, but apparently he was a lonely man alone in the woods, and we had unluckily become campsite neighbors. As the days went by, he tried to get into everything we were doing. For example, when we were preparing a big dinner, always a highlight of the trip, he brought a cooler to show us his dinner plans. At this point, 2 other friends were there, and they were just like, WTF. It was like that. We laid out the food buffet style, and as everyone was working together to bring and prepare a camp-like meal, he came over. Since our sites were far apart, we quickly gathered around, and the first contact, Big Ted, tactfully and politely asked this guy to please respect the boundaries of our campsite. To my surprise, he seemed to get the point and was a bit embarrassed. It was a no hard feelings, see you again kind of vibe. We were all relieved and actually felt a little sorry for the man. As darkness fell and we were relaxing around the campfire, getting drunk on all sorts of nasties, suddenly our neighbor came out of the darkness and into the light of the campfire. He joined our circle and sat down in front of the campfire. As he pulled his knees up to his chest, we all noticed at once that he was holding a huge Desert Eagle pistol loosely in one hand and his finger on the trigger. We froze and stared at him for what seemed like an eternity. Then he said, as casually as if, "Anybody want to check out my work?" We just stared in disbelief. Then his buddy Dave said, "Nope." I said, "No." To which the guy casually took the gun and said, "All right." He casually took the gun, got up, and walked back into the darkness. He didn't seem to have a flashlight or anything, and we were totally freaked out because we didn't know where he was. 30 minutes later, his campfire was suddenly engulfed in 7-foot-high flames. 30 minutes of intense madness ensued, and then it was over. Not a single sound was heard. What I remember is that we all stayed up quite late, and I don't think any of us slept without opening one eye that night. When we woke up the next day, he was gone. Just a melted red and yellow plastic gas can. We spent another night there and ended up having a good time, but I'd be lying if I said we weren't all a little on edge the rest of the time. My husband, myself, and our 3 daughters, all under 10. This was our annual tradition, but our schedule was packed that year due to the company's strong performance. As a result, we decided to avoid the communal sleeping arrangements and rent a camper, which the RV rental place explained was the same price for 3 nights as for 2. So we decided to return it on Monday, even though the retreat ended early Sunday. The weekend was a lot of fun. It was super hot, so it was nice to have AC. We didn't realize it at the time. Different people came and went throughout the day, and we didn't stay in the RV much all weekend due to activities. But the previous renter had not cleaned the septic piping in the camper. By 6:12 p.m. on Sunday evening, it was emitting a terrible stench and backed up into the toilet. My husband was worried that the rental company would blame us and decided to go to the Walmart in the next town over to buy some Drino. This store is open year-round but is rarely used outside of recreational areas. To be honest, I can't recall many details of why, as I haven't visited it once since that time. But I believe it is privately owned by a church in the area and used primarily for their own purposes and events. So the hub left for Walmart around 8:30 p.m. The round trip takes over an hour thanks to the rural and narrow back roads. I tidy up the camper, pack up, and get the kids settled in. By the time I have put everything away and delivered the last glass of water to an overexcited child who has been moving around all day and can't relax, he has been gone for about 40 minutes. I curled up in bed with a book and waited for my husband to return. About 20 minutes after the lights went out, I began to hear a clicking sound coming from the window behind the bed. Was it the sound of wood scraping against glass, a natural sound, or a nearby ambient noise? Or a killer with an axe? That was one of the options. I got up and walked slowly to the kitchen. The sounds followed. I climbed into the loft and was about to climb over the truck can when the door handle rattled. I grabbed my knife as I walked past the kitchen and, sweating, sat down on the edge of the loft bed to protect my children. I looked around the cabin, making sure all the doorways were locked, hoping that whoever it was, and at this point it was definitely someone, would leave. I leaned from side to side, trying to get a cell phone signal to call the camp guard, my husband, or anyone else, but it wouldn't dial. I waited, panicking. About 5 minutes into the torture, I saw headlights shining through a side porthole on the winding road to the RV site. My husband scoffed at me as a city kid and said he would never break out of a random country campsite and attack women and children. I told him that I had heard doors rattling and that it was not an accident of nature, but he brushed me off. I was so worked up I couldn't sleep, but passed the test that night without incident. The next morning we drove into town to return the RV. After the full inspection required by the rental agreement, the manager came up to my husband and asked if he knew what had happened to the rear window. Apparently someone had used a switchblade or something to remove the gasket around the rear bedroom window, where I had been reading the night before. There were scratches in the paint that looked like knife marks, and the gasket had been cut away. The window lock was also damaged. Whoever did this apparently attempted to break in by inserting a knife into the door lock and also between the jaw and the lock. Fortunately, they did not go in, so they were not charged for the RV damages. Needless to say, I never agreed to camp alone again and now always go with a large group. There are never more than a few of us. It still makes the hairs on my neck stand up. The scent of pine trees hung heavy in the air as Sarah made her way along the winding forest path. The sun was sinking below the horizon, and long shadows danced through the trees. She had chosen this remote location deep in the Appalachian Mountains because she wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and reconnect with nature. Little did she know, however, that this journey into the wilderness would lead her down a path of terror she never imagined. As darkness enveloped the forest, Sarah arrived at her chosen campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. She quickly set up her tent and built a fire, her heart racing with anticipation. The crackling fire cast flickering shadows on the forest floor, creating an eerie yet inviting atmosphere. Despite the quiet night, Sarah couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. She passed off the uneasiness as just nervousness, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings. But as the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger, leaving whispers of fear at the edges of her consciousness. As Sarah climbed into her sleeping bag, the forest was silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the wind. But something sinister lurked beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself in the darkness. The sound was so faint at first that Sarah could barely hear it. But as the sound grew louder, her heart began to race with fear. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was none. Just as Sarah began to convince herself that it was just a figment of her imagination, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence of the forest. The scream echoed through the trees, sending shivers down Sarah's spine and freezing her in place with fear. Shivering, Sarah reached for her flashlight. With a click, the ray pierced the darkness, illuminating the surrounding forest with an eerie glow. But what she saw sent her heart plummeting to her stomach. Standing beyond the edge of the campfire's light was a dark, shadowy silhouette that seemed to blend into the night. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light as it stared back at Sarah. Unable to tear her gaze away, Sarah watched in horror as the figure approached in slow motion toward her. Panic coursed through her veins and her heart raced with fear. Adrenaline spurting, Sarah fled into the darkness. Branches smashed into her face, tree roots tangled around her feet, and she nearly tumbled to the ground. But she did not stop running. She was driven by a primal instinct to escape the fear that was chasing her. She pushed herself to the brink of exhaustion and ran through the night, her lungs burning with exertion. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah broke through the tree line and stumbled into a clearing. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. As the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the horizon, Sarah raised herself up and returned to civilization. She never returned to the forest, haunted by the memory of the shadowy figures that haunted her in the darkness. To this day, Sarah hears the reverberations of that fateful night and is reminded of the horrors that lurk at the edge of the known world. And while she tries to tell herself that it was all just a nightmare, deep down she knows that the nightmare is all too real.